They called it the Devil's Garden. 500,000 mines stretched across the October sand, hidden beneath the moonlit dust like seeds of death waiting to bloom. From his forward positions, German and Italian defenders waited behind the most formidable defensive line ever constructed in North Africa. For months, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had been the scourge of the desert, the hammer that drove British forces back across Libya and deep into Egypt. Yet on this night of October 23, 1942, as the earth began to tremble under the weight of the largest artillery barrage Africa had ever witnessed, something was different. The familiar confidence that had carried German forces through victory after victory was about to be shattered. In the distance, silhouetted against the muzzle flashes of over 800 guns, new shapes moved forward through the smoke and flame. They were taller than any tank the Afrika Korps had faced before, their long barrels reaching out like accusing fingers toward carefully prepared positions. These were not the familiar Crusaders or Valentines that German panzers had dominated for 2 years. These were M4 Shermans, 252 of them, fresh from American factories and crewed by determined British tankers who had suffered too many defeats. As the first reports reached German headquarters, commanders felt the cold hand of realization. The Afrika Korps, once the master of desert warfare, was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. The technological edge that had carried German arms across North Africa had evaporated like morning dew under the desert sun. What followed would be 13 days of desperate struggle, a battle that would shatter the myth of German invincibility and begin the long retreat that would end only with complete surrender. Watch closely, for this is the moment when the tide of war turned, when American steel met German iron, and when industrial production proved decisive in modern warfare. The morning sun of October 23, 1942, cast long shadows across the hard-packed sand of El Alamein. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. To the north, the Mediterranean sparkled in the distance, while to the south, the treacherous Qattara Depression created an impassable barrier of salt marshes and soft sand that could swallow vehicles whole. Between these natural boundaries, a mere 40 miles of defensible front, the fate of North Africa would be decided. German headquarters, a collection of camouflaged tents and dugouts, buzzed with activity as staff officers bent over maps under the command of General Georg Stumme, plotting defensive positions that had taken months to prepare. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with desert dust as mechanics worked frantically on the precious few tanks that remained operational. Radio operators monitored frequencies, trying to gauge British intentions through the static and coded messages. Rommel himself was far away in Germany, having left on sick leave in late September after months of exhausting combat had taken their toll on his health. The desert climate, poor diet, and constant stress had left him suffering from severe stomach ailments, liver problems, and exhaustion. In Rommel's absence, Stumme faced an impossible situation. The Afrika Korps had only 90 tanks remaining against 800 British tanks, a disparity that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Fuel supplies were so critically short that movement had to be carefully rationed. Ammunition stocks were dwindling, with some artillery units down to less than a week's supply. Food and medical supplies were equally scarce, with Italian troops suffering particularly from inadequate rations. Yet German forces had constructed perhaps the most formidable defensive position of the Desert War. About 450,000 mines lay buried in intricate patterns, some anti-tank, others anti-personnel, creating corridors of death that would channel attacking forces into carefully prepared killing zones. The minefields stretched up to 5 miles deep in places, a massive engineering achievement accomplished despite the harsh conditions. Behind the minefields, the defensive positions were equally formidable. Anti-tank guns of various calibers waited in concealed positions, their crews trained to hold fire until enemy armor was well within effective range. The feared 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed to shoot down high-flying bombers, but discovered to be devastatingly effective against tanks, were dug in with only their long barrels visible above ground level. These guns could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Infantry positions were strengthened with concrete where available, sandbags where not. Machine gun nests were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery positions had been carefully surveyed, with pre-registered coordinates allowing accurate bombardment of likely attack routes even in darkness. Communications trenches linked the various positions, allowing movement under cover. This was no longer the fluid mobile warfare at which the Afrika Korps excelled. This was a grinding battle of attrition, and every soldier from veteran Panzer crew to newly arrived Italian conscript knew that reinforcements would be few while their enemies grew stronger each day. To the east, the British Eighth Army presented a formidable and thoroughly prepared sight. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, who had taken command only in August, had spent weeks preparing his offensive with meticulous care that bordered on obsession. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. He commanded over 190,000 men from across the British Empire and beyond, British regulars, Scottish Highlanders, Australian divisions, New Zealand brigades, South African units, Indian divisions with their mix of Hindu, Muslim and Sikh soldiers, Free French forces who had chosen to fight on after their homeland's defeat, Greek battalions eager to strike back at the Axis, and Polish units burning for revenge against Germany. This truly international force was united in purpose, determined to finally achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them for so long. The army had amassed an impressive array of armour, 1,029 tanks operational and ready for battle, including 216 Crusaders. Fast but lightly armoured, mechanically unreliable, but still useful for reconnaissance and pursuit. 194 Valentines. Slow infantry support tanks with good armour but inadequate guns. 170 Grants. The American tanks that had shocked the Germans at Gazala with their hull-mounted 75mm guns, and most importantly, 252 Shermans, the latest American design that would prove decisive. Supporting this armoured force were 2,311 artillery pieces of various calibers, from the standard 25-pounder field guns that were the backbone of British artillery to massive 5.5-inch medium guns capable of devastating bombardment. Anti-tank guns in their hundreds, including the new 6-pounder that could finally match German armour, were distributed throughout the force. Among the rows of tanks being prepared for battle, the Shermans stood out immediately. Ground crews swarmed over them, checking track tension, topping off fuel tanks, loading ammunition, testing radios. These American-built machines, operated by British crews who had spent weeks training on them, represented a revolution in Allied armoured warfare. The M4 Sherman was everything previous Allied tanks had not been: reliable, well-armed, reasonably well protected, and available in large numbers. Unlike the Grant, with its awkward hull-mounted main gun that required exposing the entire tank to fire, the Sherman carried its 75mm cannon in a fully traversing turret. This seemingly simple difference transformed tactical possibilities. At 32 tons and standing 9 feet tall, these tanks certainly presented large targets, earning them nicknames like mobile crematoriums from pessimistic crews. But their sloped frontal armour, though only 50mm thick, was angled at 56 degrees, effectively increasing its resistance to penetration. The cast hull construction, while not as strong as welded armour, allowed for faster production, a crucial consideration. Inside, British crews found an environment radically different from their own cramped vehicles. The Sherman's interior was spacious by tank standards, with logical control placement, adequate vision devices for all crew members, and even spring-loaded hatches that could be quickly opened for escape. The commander sat high in the turret with good all-around visibility through periscopes, while the gunner had a telescopic sight and periscope. The loader had ready ammunition within easy reach, while the driver and assistant driver, bow gunner, had adequate space and good controls. Most importantly, the Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition effectively. This versatility was something British tankers had desperately missed in their 2-pounder armed tanks, which could only fire solid shot. A Sherman could engage enemy tanks with armor-piercing rounds, then switch to high-explosive to suppress anti-tank guns or infantry positions. The gun was stabilized in elevation, allowing reasonably accurate fire on the move, though most crews preferred to stop for aimed shots. Power traverse for the turret meant targets could be engaged quickly, while the reliable mechanical systems meant most tanks that started a battle would still be running at its end. The stage was set for a collision between two military philosophies, two ways of war that had evolved through hard experience in the desert. On one side stood the Afrika Korps, masters of mobile warfare, the force that had earned its reputation through brilliant maneuver and tactical innovation. They had perfected the art of the tactical withdrawal, the sudden counterattack, the use of anti-tank guns as offensive weapons. Their combined arms tactics, tanks, infantry, artillery, and anti-tank guns working in close coordination, had been the model for military forces worldwide. Now they were forced into static defense by circumstances beyond their control. Fuel shortages meant that the wide-ranging maneuvers that were their trademark were impossible. The priority of the German war effort was the Eastern Front, where massive battles around Stalingrad were consuming men and material at a horrific rate. North Africa had become a secondary theatre, starved of the resources needed to maintain offensive capability. On the other side stood Montgomery's 8th Army, equipped with American tanks and backed by seemingly unlimited supplies flowing through Egyptian ports. Where Rommel had to count every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, Montgomery could afford to be lavish. British supply officers calculated that the offensive would require 600,000 gallons of fuel, 500,000 artillery shells, 8 million rounds of small arms ammunition, and they had it all, with more arriving daily. The desert railway had been extended forward, water pipelines laid, supply dumps carefully camouflaged and dispersed to avoid air attack. Field hospitals were prepared for the expected casualties, blood supplies stockpiled, surgical teams briefed. This was industrial warfare, where victory would go not to the most skillful, but to the best supplied. As the sun set on October 22nd, both armies made final preparations. In the German lines, soldiers who had survived 2 years of desert warfare checked their weapons one more time and counted their remaining ammunition. Veterans wrote letters home, knowing that this battle would be different from the fluid engagements they had known. They had seen the British build-up, watched through binoculars as tank after tank arrived at the front. They knew what was coming. Italian troops, who made up the majority of the Axis infantry, worked to improve their positions. The Italian divisions, Trieste, Bologna, Brescia, Pavia, Folgore, varied greatly in quality and equipment. The Folgore paratroopers were elite troops, as good as any in the desert, but they were infantry fighting in a tank battle. The regular infantry divisions were poorly equipped, their morale shaky after months of defeats and the obvious material superiority of their enemies. They dug deeper into their foxholes, strung more barbed wire, laid final mines. In the British lines, a different atmosphere prevailed. Tank crews made final checks on their Shermans, going through routines drilled into them during weeks of training. Drivers checked oil levels, track tension, steering controls. Gunners ensured their sights were clean, ammunition properly stowed. Loaders counted rounds, armor-piercing with black tips, high-explosive painted yellow, smoke rounds for concealment. Commanders studied aerial photographs of their objectives one last time, memorizing landmarks that might be visible through dust and smoke. Radio operators tested frequencies, using the elaborate code names that British forces delighted in. Divisions named after flowers, objectives after birds, phase lines after fish. Infantry units moved forward under cover of darkness to their assault positions. The Highland regiments, Seaforths, Camerons, Black Watch, checked their bayonets and adjusted their distinctive headgear. Australian divisions, veterans of the Siege of Tobruk, who called themselves the Rats of Tobruk with pride, moved with the confidence of men who had faced the Afrika Korps before, and held. New Zealanders under General Freyberg, himself covered in scars from the First World War, prepared for another night attack. South African divisions, fighting far from home in a cause that not all their countrymen supported, nonetheless prepared to do their duty. Indian brigades, Sikhs, Punjabis, Gurkhas with their curved kukri knives, waited with the patient courage that had made them the backbone of Britain's imperial armies. Engineers, the unsung heroes of the coming battle, made final preparations for their dangerous work. They would have to clear lanes through the minefields under fire, marking safe passages for the armour to follow. Each man carried heavy mine detectors, the new Polish design that used electromagnetic fields to locate metal objects. They also carried tape to mark cleared lanes, stakes to hold the tape, and tools to disarm mines. Many also carried rifles or Sten guns, knowing they might have to fight as infantry if discovered. It was perhaps the most dangerous job in the entire army, requiring steady nerves to work methodically while under fire, knowing that one mistake meant death or maiming. Behind the lines, artillery positions made ready. Hundreds of guns were lined up, their crews making final adjustments. Forward observers had spent days identifying targets, calculating ranges, adjusting for wind and temperature. Massive ammunition supplies were stacked ready. The opening bombardment alone would require over 600,000 shells. Medical units prepared for the inevitable casualties, surgeons checking their instruments, nurses preparing bandages and morphine, stretcher bearers studying routes to the aid posts. Military police took position to direct traffic through the confusion that would inevitably come, while signal units strung last-minute telephone wires, knowing that despite all precautions, communications would be one of the first casualties of battle. At 9:40 p.m. on October 23, 1942, the waiting ended. The desert night erupted as over 800 guns opened fire simultaneously, their muzzles flashing in sequence as fire plans were executed. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that could be heard in Alexandria, over 60 miles away. Shells screamed through the darkness, high explosive to blast positions, shrapnel to scythe down infantry in the open, smoke to blind observers. The ground shook under the bombardment, dust and smoke rising in great clouds illuminated by the constant flashes. For 20 minutes this steel storm continued, 600 tons of explosive falling on Axis positions. German and Italian soldiers huddled in their trenches and bunkers as the earth heaved around them. Communications lines were cut in the first minutes, command posts destroyed or isolated, observation positions blinded. Men were deafened by the continuous explosions, concussed by near misses, buried alive when direct hits collapsed trenches. Some emerged from the bombardment shocked into near paralysis, others fighting mad and ready to sell their lives dearly. But all knew that this was only the beginning. The barrage was lifting, and through the dust and smoke they could hear the sound of engines and the skirl of bagpipes as the British infantry began their advance. Operation Lightfoot had begun, and with it the Second Battle of El Alamein. The name was almost ironic. There would be nothing light about the fighting that followed. It would be a grinding, brutal battle of attrition, where success would be measured in yards and paid for in blood. The Devil's Gardens would claim their harvest, tanks would burn, and men would die in their thousands. But when the smoke finally cleared, the entire strategic situation in North Africa would be transformed, and the road to final Allied victory would be open. The roots of this climactic battle stretched back through years of desert warfare, a seesaw struggle that had swung back and forth across the coastal strip of Libya and Egypt. To understand why Montgomery now commanded over 250 Shermans, while Rommel could muster barely 90 tanks of all types, to comprehend how American industrial might had tipped the balance so decisively, we must trace the path that brought both armies to this decisive moment. The conflict in North Africa had been ignited in 1940 by Italy's invasion of Egypt from its colony of Libya. Mussolini, eager to share in what seemed like certain German victory and to build his new Roman Empire, had ordered Marshal Graziani to advance into Egypt. It was a decision that would ultimately lead to the destruction of Italy's African empire and contribute to Mussolini's own downfall. The Italian army that crossed the frontier in September 1940 was large, over 200,000 men, but poorly equipped, badly led, and lacking in motor transport. They advanced slowly, methodically, building a series of fortified camps that stretched like a chain from the Libyan border to Sidi Barrani, about 60 miles inside Egypt. The British response, when it came in December 1940, was devastating. Operation Compass, originally planned as a limited raid, turned into a rout. General O'Connor's Western Desert Force, though outnumbered 4-1, smashed through the Italian positions with tanks and motorized infantry. The Italian camps, placed too far apart to support each other, fell one by one. Thousands of prisoners were taken, so many that the British had difficulty guarding and feeding them. The pursuit continued into Libya, with Australian troops capturing the vital port of Tobruk in January 1941, and the advance continuing toward Tripoli. By February 1941, the entire Italian 10th Army had been destroyed, with over 130,000 prisoners taken for the loss of less than 2,000 British and Commonwealth troops. Hitler could not allow his ally to collapse completely. The loss of Libya would expose Italy itself to invasion, potentially knocking Germany's principal ally out of the war. More importantly, it would free British forces for use elsewhere, perhaps in Greece, where German intervention was already being planned. The Führer's solution was to send a blocking force to Africa, just enough to stabilize the situation and prevent complete Italian collapse. For this mission, he chose an officer who had distinguished himself commanding a Panzer division in France, Erwin Rommel. The Afrika Korps was formed on January 11, 1941, initially consisting of just one division, the 5th Light, later renamed 21st Panzer Division. Rommel was designated as commander on February 11th, though he was technically subordinate to Italian command. The 15th Panzer Division would follow later, giving Rommel a force that, while small, was well equipped and expertly trained. These were not garrison troops or second-line units, but first-class formations with modern equipment and experienced personnel. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, and immediately set about transforming the situation. Where Italian commanders had been cautious and defensive-minded, Rommel was aggressive to the point of recklessness. He understood that in desert warfare, mobility was everything. The vast spaces, lack of natural obstacles, and limited road networks meant that whoever could move fastest and furthest would hold the advantage. Within weeks of arriving, despite orders to remain on the defensive until more forces arrived, Rommel launched his first offensive. The British, weakened by the withdrawal of their best units to Greece, were caught completely off guard. In a lightning campaign that earned him promotion and the nickname Desert Fox, Rommel swept across Cyrenaica, recapturing all the territory the Italians had lost except for Tobruk, which held out in a siege that would last 8 months. By April 1941, German forces were on the Egyptian frontier, threatening the Suez Canal and Britain's entire position in the Middle East. For nearly 2 years, the war in North Africa followed a repetitive pattern. One side would advance until its supply lines became overstretched, then the other would counterattack and drive them back. The desert was an unforgiving battlefield. Vast distances, extreme temperatures, and lack of water made every operation a logistical nightmare. Vehicles required constant maintenance as sand clogged air filters and wore out moving parts. Men suffered from dysentery, desert sores, and heat exhaustion. Navigation required special skills, with sun compasses and star shots replacing conventional maps in the featureless terrain. Throughout 1941 and early 1942, the Afrika Korps held a decisive edge in both equipment quality and crew skill. The Panzer III, the backbone of German armoured forces, was superior to most British tanks. Armed initially with a 37mm gun, most had been upgunned to a 50mm weapon that could penetrate British armour at combat ranges. The Panzer IV, fewer in number, carried a short 75mm gun designed for infantry support, but still effective against tanks. More importantly, these tanks were mechanically reliable, designed from the outset for mobile warfare. German tactical doctrine, refined in Poland and France, emphasized combined arms cooperation. Tanks didn't operate alone, but in close coordination with motorized infantry, artillery, and anti-tank guns. The Germans had perfected the art of the mobile defense, drawing British tanks onto screens of anti-tank guns, especially the deadly 88mm, then counter-attacking with their own armour. Radio communications allowed rapid coordination, while experienced crews could maintain and repair their vehicles even in combat conditions. The British struggled to match this effectiveness. Their tank designs reflected pre-war thinking that had separated tanks into infantry tanks, slow, heavily armoured vehicles designed to support foot soldiers, and cruiser tanks, fast but lightly armoured vehicles intended for mobile operations. Neither type proved adequate in the desert. The infantry tanks like the Matilda were too slow to catch German forces, while cruiser tanks like the Crusader were mechanically unreliable and poorly armed. The standard British tank gun was the 2-pounder, a 40mm weapon that had been adequate in 1940 but was increasingly obsolete. It could only fire solid armour-piercing shot, useless against infantry or anti-tank guns. German tanks could engage at ranges where the 2-pounder couldn't penetrate, while British tanks had to close to near-suicidal distances to have any chance of success. Time and again, British armoured attacks broke apart against German defences, with tanks charging forward only to be picked off by hidden anti-tank guns or outmanoeuvred by more experienced Panzer crews. The nadir came at Gazala in May-June 1942, where Rommel's brilliant manoeuvre warfare destroyed British armoured strength and led to the fall of Tobruk. Yet even in victory, the seeds of future defeat were visible. At Gazala, a new enemy had appeared, the M3 Grant tank, supplied by the United States under Lend-Lease. The Grant was an awkward design, with its main 75mm gun mounted in the hull rather than the turret, but it could finally match German tanks in firepower. As Rommel himself noted in his papers, the appearance of the Grant marked the end of clear German tank superiority. The Grant's hull-mounted gun required the entire tank to be exposed to fire, and its high silhouette made it an easy target. But its 75mm gun could fire both armour-piercing and high-explosive rounds effectively, giving it a versatility British tanks had lacked. More importantly, it was mechanically reliable, based on proven American automotive technology. For the first time, British armoured units had a tank that could engage German armour on equal terms, even if its design was flawed. But the Grant was merely a stopgap, and everyone knew it. Even as Grants were being rushed to Egypt, a better tank was already in production in American factories. The M4 Sherman took the Grant's reliable chassis and automotive systems, but mounted the 75mm gun in a fully rotating turret. It incorporated lessons learned from studying German and British tank designs, combining reasonable armour protection with good mobility and firepower. Most importantly, it was designed from the outset for mass production, with automotive manufacturers applying assembly line techniques refined over decades of building cars and trucks. The United States had initially considered sending an entire armoured division under General Patton to reinforce Egypt, but logistical considerations and the need for American forces elsewhere led to a different decision. Instead of sending American troops, they would send American tanks to be operated by experienced British crews. It was faster to ship tanks than entire divisions, and the British had the trained personnel and desert experience to use them effectively. By September 1942, over 300 Shermans had arrived in Egypt, with more on the way. As autumn 1942 arrived, the strategic situation had shifted decisively against the Axis. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning in favor of the Allies, allowing more supplies to reach Egypt via the Cape route. Malta, which had been under virtual siege, was reinforced and resumed its attacks on Axis shipping. The results were dramatic. In October 1942, less than 30% of supplies sent from Italy reached North Africa. Rommel's forces, already stretched thin, began to feel the pinch acutely. Fuel shortages were particularly critical. The Afrika Korps had always operated on a logistical shoestring, but now the situation was desperate. Tanks were limited to essential movement only. Training was curtailed to save fuel. Even basic reconnaissance became difficult as vehicle use was restricted. Rommel was forced to rely increasingly on fuel flown from Crete in transport aircraft, a method that could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. The Italian Navy, which had never been enthusiastic about the North African campaign, proved incapable of protecting convoys from British submarines and aircraft based in Malta. Meanwhile, vast resources poured into Egypt. The British had learned from their defeats and were determined not to repeat past mistakes. Montgomery, appointed to command the Eighth Army after his predecessor was killed in an air crash, insisted on overwhelming material superiority before attacking. He would not be rushed by Churchill's impatience or political pressure. Week after week, tanks, guns, vehicles and supplies arrived at Egyptian ports. The desert railway was extended forward, water pipelines laid, vast supply dumps established. It was a build-up on a scale the desert had never seen. The M4 Sherman that emerged from American factories represented more than just another tank design. It embodied an entire philosophy of warfare. Where German designers created increasingly sophisticated machines that required skilled crews and extensive maintenance, American designers prioritized simplicity, reliability, and ease of production. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II by any measure. Its armor was adequate rather than exceptional, its gun good rather than outstanding. But it was good enough, and it could be produced in vast numbers. The Sherman's design reflected hard-learned lessons from observing combat in Europe and North Africa. The hull was welded rather than riveted, eliminating the problem of rivets becoming projectiles when hit. The armor was sloped to increase effective thickness, though at 50 mm on the front, it was still vulnerable to German high-velocity guns. The turret was cast in one piece, speeding production, with a bustle at the rear for radio equipment. The driver and assistant driver sat in the front hull with good visibility through periscopes, while the three-man turret crew had adequate space to work. The engine, a reliable 400-horsepower Ford GAA V8 or similar power plant, gave the Sherman good mobility and reasonable fuel economy. The transmission was robust and simple, while the vertical volute spring suspension, though not as sophisticated as German torsion bar systems, was easy to maintain and repair. Track design allowed for rubber blocks that reduced wear on roads, while the tracks themselves could be easily replaced in field conditions. Inside the turret, British crews found an environment radically different from their own cramped vehicles. The commander sat behind and above the gunner with excellent all-around visibility through periscopes and vision blocks. The gunner had both a telescopic sight for precise aiming and a periscope for general observation. The loader stood on the left side of the gun with ready ammunition in racks around the turret. A power traverse system allowed rapid target engagement, while the gun was stabilized in elevation, though most crews preferred to halt for accurate shooting. The 75mm M3 gun was the Sherman's main armament, a weapon that balanced firepower, accuracy, and versatility. It could penetrate around 60mm of armor at 1,000 yards with standard armor-piercing ammunition, adequate against most German tanks in 1942. High explosive rounds were highly effective against anti-tank guns, infantry positions, and soft vehicles. Smoke rounds allowed tanks to conceal their movement or blind enemy positions. The gun's accuracy was good, with experienced crews able to hit tank-sized targets at 800 to 1,000 yards. British crews also appreciated the Sherman's mechanical reliability. Unlike their own tanks, which required constant maintenance and frequently broke down, Shermans could run for hundreds of miles with basic care. Air filters could be cleaned in minutes, track tension adjusted with simple tools, engines accessed through large deck hatches. Spare parts were interchangeable and plentiful. A Sherman that started a battle would likely finish it, and one that survived today's fight would be ready for tomorrow's. However, the Sherman had significant weaknesses that would become tragically apparent. The placement of ammunition in sponsons along the hull sides meant that penetrating hits often caused catastrophic explosions. The gasoline engine and fuel tanks were vulnerable to fire, the dreaded brew-up that gave the tank its grim nickname of Ronson or Tommy Cooker. Escape hatches were adequate but not ideal, and crews learned to bail out quickly when hit. Despite these flaws, the Sherman's advantages far outweighed its disadvantages in 1942. British tactical doctrine evolved rapidly to maximize Sherman's strengths while minimizing weaknesses. Combined arms teams became the norm, with tanks, infantry, artillery, and anti-tank guns working in close coordination. Shermans would provide mobile firepower, suppressing enemy positions while infantry cleared anti-tank guns. Artillery observers in Sherman command tanks could call down devastating barrages on German strongpoints. Engineers in specialized vehicles would clear paths through minefields for the armor to exploit. Training intensified as Sherman-equipped units prepared for the coming offensive. Crews practiced battle drills until they became automatic. The loader's dance as he fed rounds into the breech, the gunner's routine of observation, aiming and firing, the driver's techniques for navigating rough terrain while providing a stable gun platform. Radio procedures were refined to allow rapid communication in battle. Recognition drills ensured crews could distinguish friend from foe in the dust and confusion of combat. Montgomery's plan for El Alamein reflected both the strengths and limitations of his forces. He would not attempt the kind of fluid maneuver battle at which Rommel excelled. Instead, he would use his material superiority to fight a deliberate battle of attrition. The plan called for a methodical advance through the Axis defences, accepting heavy casualties to break through the minefields and defensive positions. Once a breach was achieved, armour would pour through to exploit the success. It was unimaginative, but suited to the forces available and the situation faced. By October 22, 1942, everything was ready. The Eighth Army had achieved a superiority in men and material that dwarfed anything seen previously in the Desert War. Over 190,000 men faced 50,000 Germans and 54,000 Italians. In armour, the disparity was even greater. 1,029 operational Allied tanks against fewer than 500 Axis tanks of all types, of which only 211 were German. In artillery, the Allies fielded over 2,300 guns against 1,219 Axis pieces. In the air, the Desert Air Force had achieved almost complete superiority, with over 750 aircraft available against 350 German and Italian planes. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. The quality differential had shifted dramatically. Where once German tanks had been clearly superior, now the Sherman had evened the odds. The Panzer III, which made up the bulk of German armour, was outclassed by the Sherman in firepower and armour. Only the long-barreled Panzer IV could match the American tank, and Rommel had just 30 of these. The rest of his armour consisted of older Panzer IIIs, obsolete Panzer IIs useful only for reconnaissance, and Italian M13/40 tanks that were death traps for their crews. In anti-tank guns, the Germans retained an edge with their superb 88mm weapons, but they had too few to cover the entire front. The 50mm PaK-38 was effective against Shermans at medium range, but the Allies now had their own effective anti-tank guns. The new British 6-pounder could penetrate German armour while the Americans had supplied 57mm guns that were equally effective. The old days when German anti-tank guns could engage with impunity were over. Perhaps most critically, the logistics situation was now reversed. Where Rommel had to husband every shell, every gallon of fuel, Montgomery could afford to be profligate. The fire plan for the opening bombardment alone called for 592,000 shells to be fired in the first 24 hours. Fuel reserves were sufficient for weeks of operations. Ammunition was stockpiled at levels that seemed fantastic to veterans of earlier battles. Water, always precious in the desert, was available through pipelines that stretched back to the Nile. Food, medical supplies, spare parts, everything an army needed was available in abundance. The stage was set for what would become one of the decisive battles of World War II. On one side stood the Afrika Korps, reduced by months of attrition, starved of supplies, forced to fight a kind of battle alien to its nature. On the other stood Montgomery's 8th Army, rebuilt, reinforced, and equipped with the best weapons American industry could provide. The outcome might seem predetermined, but wars are not won by materiel alone. The Afrika Korps remained a formidable opponent, its soldiers veterans of 2 years of desert warfare, their officers skilled in the art of defensive battle. The minefields were deep, the positions strong, the defenders determined. What followed would test both armies to their limits. For 13 days and nights, the battle raged with an intensity that surpassed anything previously seen in the Desert War. Tanks burned, men died in their thousands, and the fate of North Africa hung in the balance. But when the smoke finally cleared, the myth of German invincibility lay shattered, and American industrial might had proven decisive. The Sherman tank, product of Detroit's assembly lines, had met the Panzer, product of German engineering, and emerged victorious. The tide of war had turned, and it would not turn back. The battle began with carefully orchestrated violence. Operation Lightfoot opened at 9:40 p.m. with a barrage that shook the earth. Over 800 guns opened fire simultaneously in a display of firepower that dwarfed anything previously seen in North Africa. The fire plan, worked out in meticulous detail, called for specific targets to be engaged in sequence. Counter-battery fire sought out known Axis gun positions. Harassment fire fell on communication centres, supply dumps, and vehicle parks. The barrage crept forward at timed intervals, forcing defenders to remain under cover as British infantry advanced behind the curtain of steel. For 20 minutes the bombardment continued without pause. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it lifted. In the relative quiet that followed, punctuated by the crack of rifles and chatter of machine guns, the infantry went forward. Operation Lightfoot had earned its name from the fact that men on foot were too light to detonate anti-tank mines, allowing them to advance where vehicles could not. But there was nothing light about the fighting that followed. The mine clearance teams went first, engineers moving in the darkness with their heavy detectors, sweeping back and forth in precise patterns. Behind them came infantry with bayonets fixed, ready to deal with any defenders who had survived the bombardment. The plan called for 2 corridors to be cleared through the minefields, one in the north for XXX Corps, one in the south for XYYR Corps. Each corridor needed to be 24 feet wide to allow tanks to pass in single file, marked with white tape that would show up in the darkness. Progress was agonizingly slow. The minefields were deeper than expected, some stretching for 3 miles or more. German S-mines, designed to leap into the air and spray shrapnel at waist height, took a terrible toll on the engineers. Italian engineers had laid their mines in irregular patterns that defied the systematic clearance methods the British had practiced. Booby traps linked mines together so that disarming one detonated others. All the while, German and Italian artillery, recovering from the initial bombardment, began to bring down defensive fire on the corridors. Dawn on October 24th found the attack bogged down in the minefields. Engineers had cleared paths partway through, but nowhere had they achieved complete penetration. The narrow corridors were clogged with vehicles, Tanks, artillery, supply trucks all jammed together in traffic jams that would have been comic if not for the shells falling among them. Dust clouds raised by the vehicles made navigation almost impossible. Units became mixed up, radio frequencies jammed with calls for directions, orders, and reports of casualties. It was at this critical moment that tragedy struck the German command. General Stumme, perhaps trying to get a clearer picture of the confused fighting, decided to visit the front lines personally. Accompanied only by his aide and a driver, he set out in a staff car for the 90th Light Division's positions. In the confusion of battle, with British troops having infiltrated German lines during the night, the car blundered into an enemy position. Machine gun fire riddled the vehicle, killing Stumme's aide instantly. The driver, wounded but still conscious, managed to turn the car around and race for safety. Stumme, trying to take cover, had leapt from the moving vehicle. But the 56-year-old general, who suffered from high blood pressure and had been warned by doctors about his heart, collapsed in the desert. The strain of combat, the shock of the ambush, and his pre-existing condition combined fatally. His body was found the next day beside the track, unmarked by wounds. The Afrika Korps had lost its commander at the worst possible moment, with the battle barely begun. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma took temporary command, trying desperately to coordinate the defence while awaiting Rommel's return. But the defensive battle was not going according to plan. The British attack, rather than coming in distinct thrusts that could be countered, seemed to be everywhere at once. The diversionary attack in the south by the 13th Corps had convinced Axis commanders to hold their reserves there. Free French forces at Himaymat Ridge, fighting with the desperation of men who had lost their homeland, tied down German and Italian units that were desperately needed elsewhere. In the north, where the main effort was concentrated, the battle degenerated into a grinding match. British armour, finally clear of the worst minefields by midday on October 24th, pushed forward into the German defensive positions. Here, they met the anti-tank gun screens that had been the death of so many British attacks. But this time, it was different. Shermans engaged the anti-tank guns with high-explosive shells, while British artillery, guided by forward observers, brought down concentrations on identified positions. Infantry worked forward, clearing positions with grenade and bayonet. The first major tank engagement occurred near Kidney Ridge, a slight elevation that gave good fields of fire across the desert. Elements of the 15th Panzer Division, the Afrika Korps' most experienced formation, moved forward to contain the British breakthrough. They met Shermans of the 2nd Armoured Brigade in a clash that would set the pattern for the battle. German tank commanders, veterans of dozens of desert engagements, manoeuvred with skill, seeking to close the range where their experience might tell. But the Shermans, fighting from hull-down positions, had the advantage in firepower and armour. A Panzer III, advancing at speed to close the range, took a 75mm round through its frontal armour. The crew barely escaped before ammunition exploded, turning the tank into a funeral pyre. Another tried to flank the British position, but ran into a screen of 6-pounder anti-tank guns that left it burning. The Germans fell back, leaving several destroyed tanks on the battlefield. It was a small engagement by the standards of what would come, but psychologically significant. British tank crews, accustomed to being outgunned and outfought, had held their ground and driven off the Afrika Korps. Rommel arrived back in Africa late on October 25th, having flown from Germany despite his doctor's protests. He found a situation far worse than he had imagined. Half his tanks were already destroyed or damaged. Fuel supplies were critical. Some units had enough for only 50 miles of movement. Ammunition expenditure in the first 2 days had been enormous, with no hope of adequate resupply. Most seriously, the British had achieved penetrations in both the north and south that threatened to unhinge the entire defensive position. The Desert Fox immediately took control, but even his tactical genius could not overcome material deficiencies. He ordered the 21st Panzer Division north from its positions facing the southern attack, correctly judging that Montgomery's main effort was in the coastal sector. But moving an entire division consumed precious fuel, and when they arrived, they found British positions already consolidated. The Shermans were dug in, supported by anti-tank guns and artillery, presenting no flanks to turn and no weak points to exploit. October 27th saw the climax of the armoured battles. Rommel, in a desperate attempt to throw the British back, committed his last reserves. The 21st Panzer Division, reinforced with every available tank, launched a counterattack aimed at Kidney Ridge. They advanced with all their old skill, using ground for cover, coordinating with anti-tank guns, trying to achieve local superiority. For a few hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Shermans burned as 88mm rounds found their mark. A troop of Grants, caught in the open, was destroyed in minutes. British infantry, overrun by German tanks, fought desperately with inadequate anti-tank weapons. But the arithmetic of attrition was inexorable. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. British artillery, with seemingly unlimited ammunition, blanketed German assembly areas. The Desert Air Force, enjoying almost complete air superiority, bombed and strafed anything that moved. By nightfall on October 27th, the German counterattack had failed. The 21st Panzer Division limped back with fewer than 15 operational tanks. The 15th Panzer was in no better shape. The Italian armoured divisions, equipped with tanks that were obsolete when the war began, had virtually ceased to exist as fighting formations. Rommel knew the battle was lost, but Hitler's orders were to hold at all costs. The Führer, engaged in his own desperate battle at Stalingrad, could not contemplate retreat in Africa. Montgomery, sensing that the crisis of the battle was approaching, prepared for one final blow. Operation Supercharge, launched on November 2nd, concentrated overwhelming force at a single point. The artillery preparation was the heaviest yet, with over 300 guns firing on a front of just 4,000 yards. Behind the barrage came infantry of the 51st Highland Division and 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats. And behind them, waiting for the breakthrough, were the Shermans. The German defence finally cracked. Exhausted after 10 days of continuous fighting, out of ammunition and fuel, the surviving defenders could no longer hold. Italian infantry, who had fought with surprising determination, began to surrender in large numbers. German units conducted a fighting withdrawal, but gaps opened that could not be closed. On November 3rd, Rommel ordered a general retreat, defying Hitler's stand-fast order. He knew that to remain meant the complete destruction of the Afrika Korps. The pursuit that followed was constrained only by logistics and exhaustion. Shermans led the advance, their mechanical reliability allowing them to maintain pressure on the retreating Axis forces. Unlike previous pursuits, where British tanks had broken down in droves, the Shermans kept running. They overran supply dumps, scattered rearguard units, and turned the retreat into a rout. The coast road became a highway of death as the Desert Air Force caught concentrated columns of vehicles. The scale of the victory became clear as November progressed. The Axis had lost over 30,000 men captured, along with thousands more killed and wounded. Of 500 tanks that had started the battle, fewer than 20 escaped. Artillery, anti-tank guns, vehicles, all the equipment of a modern army was left behind, destroyed or captured. The Afrika Korps, which had entered Egypt as conquerors, left as fugitives. Rommel himself captured the despair in a letter to his wife. The army is in no state to make a stand anywhere. For the British and Commonwealth forces, casualties had been heavy, over 13,000 killed, wounded and missing. Tank losses exceeded 500, though many were repairable. But unlike the Axis, these losses could be replaced. New Shermans were already arriving in Egypt. Trained crews were available to man them. The supply pipeline that had delivered victory at El Alamein would continue to function, ensuring that Montgomery's pursuit would not falter for lack of resources. Churchill, receiving the news in London, ordered church bells rung for the first time since 1940. In his speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet on November 10th, he captured the significance of the moment. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. For the first time, British forces had defeated the Germans in a major battle without special circumstances. The victory was not due to German overextension or desperate defense or fortunate timing. It was a straightforward triumph of planning, material superiority, and fighting quality. The strategic consequences rippled across the globe. Operation Torch, the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria, commenced on November 8th, just days after Rommel began his retreat. The timing was not coincidental. The landings had been postponed until El Alamein was won to ensure that Axis forces could not be transferred from Egypt. Now the Germans and Italians faced war on two fronts in Africa, caught between Montgomery advancing from the east and Anglo-American forces pressing from the west. For the individuals who fought at El Alamein, the battle marked a personal as well as military transformation. British tank crews who had spent 2 years learning that attacking meant dying now found themselves pursuing a beaten enemy. The psychological scars of repeated defeat began to heal, replaced by confidence that grew with each mile of advance. Veterans spoke of the change in atmosphere, the sense that they were no longer the underdogs, but part of an unstoppable force. German and Italian soldiers faced a harsher transformation. The Afrika Korps, elite formation that had symbolized German military prowess, conducted a retreat that tested every military virtue. Tank crews who had grown accustomed to technical superiority now faced enemies with better equipment in overwhelming numbers. They fought skillful rearguard actions, made tactical withdrawals that saved units from annihilation, maintained discipline when others might have collapsed. But they were fighting the arithmetic of modern war, and arithmetic is merciless. Between El Alamein and the final surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, the Axis would lose over 250,000 men captured, along with vast quantities of equipment. 3 experienced German divisions, the 15th Panzer, 21st Panzer, and 91st Light, would be destroyed, their expertise and esprit lost forever. Italian forces in Africa would cease to exist. The Mediterranean, which Mussolini had called Mare Nostrum, our sea, would become an Allied lake. For military doctrine, El Alamein marked a fundamental shift. The era of small professional armies winning through superior skill was ending. Industrial warfare had arrived, where victory went to those who could produce the most and supply it the furthest. The German model of war, based on quality over quantity, would struggle increasingly against Allied material superiority. Future German tanks would grow ever larger and more complex, but they could never be produced in sufficient numbers. The Sherman tank that had proven decisive at El Alamein would go on to become the most produced American tank of the war. From the original M4A1 with its cast hull to the M4A3E8 Easy 8 with improved suspension and a 76mm gun, over 49,000 would be built. They would serve in every theatre, adapted for every role: tank destroyers, assault guns, engineer vehicles, recovery vehicles, even amphibious tanks. Each variant built on lessons learned, but all traced their ancestry back to the tanks that broke through at El Alamein. For Rommel, El Alamein began a long retreat that would end with his death. Never again would he command victorious advances or demonstrate the tactical brilliance that had made him famous. In Normandy in 1944, he would face the same material superiority that had defeated him in Africa, with the same results. Implicated in the plot against Hitler after the July 20th assassination attempt, he was forced to commit suicide rather than face a show trial. His funeral, with full military honours, was Nazi Germany's last attempt to maintain the myth of the noble warrior. But the man himself knew better. In modern war, nobility was no match for productivity. The desert battlefields returned to silence after the armies passed. Burned-out tanks became landmarks for nomads, their rusting hulks gradually covered by sand. But the legacy of violence remained. Hundreds of thousands of mines laid by both sides created death zones that persist to this day. Since systematic recording began, over 3,000 people have been killed and 7,500 maimed by these remnants of war. Clearance efforts continue, but at current rates, it will take centuries to make the desert safe. Veterans of El Alamein, growing fewer each year, remember different things. British tankers recall the elation of finally having equipment that matched their courage. Germans remember the bitter frustration of fighting against impossible odds. Italians recall the sense of abandonment, sent to fight with inadequate weapons for a cause many didn't believe in. All remember the desert itself, the heat that could kill, the cold nights, the flies that tormented wounded men, the vast spaces that reduced human ambition to insignificance. Historians have argued about El Alameин's significance. Some claim Montgomery was too cautious, that a more aggressive commander could have destroyed the Afrika Korps entirely. Others point out that the victory was inevitable given the material superiority, that any competent general would have won. But these arguments miss the point. El Alamein was significant not because it was brilliantly fought, but because it was won at all. It proved that the Allies could match the Germans in a straight fight, that American production and British determination could overcome German skill. The lessons of El Alamein remain relevant in our modern age. Technology matters, but it must be wedded to proper doctrine and training. Industrial capacity can be a war-winning weapon, but it must be mobilized effectively. Professional military excellence is important, but it cannot overcome fundamental material disadvantages indefinitely. Most importantly, in modern industrial warfare, the side that can produce more, supply more, and replace losses faster will usually prevail. Today, El Alamein is a small town on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, notable mainly for war cemeteries and a museum. The battlefield itself has been reclaimed by development, though careful observers can still find traces. A depression that was a tank scrape, fragments of metal in the sand, the occasional dangerous surprise of an unexploded shell. Tourists come to see where the Desert War was decided, where Montgomery met Rommel and won. But the real monument to El Alamein is not in Egypt, but in the transformation it represented. When those 252 Shermans rolled forward on October 23, 1942, they carried more than their crews. They bore the productive capacity of American factories, the determination of British forces to reverse 2 years of defeat, the hopes of occupied Europe that Germany could be beaten. Against that combination, even the legendary Afrika Korps could only fight, retreat, and ultimately surrender. The age of industrial warfare had truly arrived, announced not by manifestos or declarations, but by the rumble of mass-produced engines across ancient sand. In the Devil's Gardens of El Alamein, where death waited beneath the surface and courage was measured in yards gained, American steel had met German iron. Steel had won, not because it was superior in any individual quality, but because there was so much more of it. In modern war, that often makes all the difference. The desert remembers its dead in its own way. Sometimes, after storms, the sand shifts to reveal artifacts of battle, a helmet, a water bottle, sometimes human remains. These fragments of history remind us that behind the statistics and strategies were individual human beings who faced death in a foreign land for causes they may not have fully understood. They fought with the weapons their nations gave them, followed the orders their leaders issued, and died by the thousands when those weapons and orders proved insufficient. Rommel and Montgomery, the two commanders forever linked by El Alamein, represented different military traditions. Rommel was the last of the great cavalry commanders, translated to the age of tanks. He led from the front, made intuitive decisions, took risks that sometimes brought spectacular success and sometimes disaster. Montgomery was the first of the modern industrial commanders, carefully calculating odds, building up overwhelming superiority, taking no chances with his citizen soldiers' lives. At El Alamein, the modern overwhelmed the traditional. Perhaps that is El Alamein's greatest lesson. War had become too serious for heroes, too destructive for gallantry, too vast for individual genius to overcome material facts. The Sherman tank, prosaic product of Detroit assembly lines, had met the Panzer, heir to Prussian military tradition, and won through sheer numbers. It was not romantic, not the stuff of legend, but it was effective. In war, effectiveness matters more than romance. As the last veterans pass away and El Alamein recedes into history, its significance remains. It was the battle that proved industrial democracy could defeat military autocracy, that citizen soldiers with adequate equipment could match professional warriors, that in modern war, production lines matter as much as bloodlines. When the Devil's Gardens finally bloomed with fire and steel in October 1942, they revealed a new world where American production and British determination could overcome any enemy. That revelation changed not just the course of World War II, but the nature of warfare itself. In the end, El Alamein stands as proof that in the arithmetic of modern war, courage must be multiplied by equipment, skill by supplies, and valor by vehicles. When one side has 252 modern tanks and the other has 90 obsolete ones, when one side has unlimited fuel and the other counts every gallon, when one side can replace losses and the other cannot, the outcome becomes mathematical rather than mystical. Rommel discovered this truth in the hardest way possible, watching his legendary Afrika Korps ground down by superior numbers and firepower. Montgomery applied this truth with methodical precision, trading lives for victory in a calculation that earlier generals might have found abhorrent, but that modern war made necessary. The Sherman tank that emerged victorious at El Alamein would fight on through Italy, France, and Germany, improved but essentially unchanged. It was never the best tank of the war, never the most feared or respected. But it was there when needed, in numbers that mattered, with crews who learned to maximize its strengths and minimize its weaknesses. Like the democracy that produced it, the Sherman succeeded not through individual excellence but through collective effort, not through sophistication but through simplicity, not through quality but through quantity. That, perhaps, is the final lesson of El Alamein. In the Devil's Gardens where death waited beneath innocent sand, in the burning tanks where men died for causes larger than themselves, in the arithmetic of shells fired and fuel consumed, modern warfare revealed its essential nature. It was not about heroes or glory, tradition or excellence. It was about production and logistics, supply and replacement, the mundane mathematics of industrial power. The side that understood this first and applied it most effectively would win. At El Alamein, that side used Sherman tanks to break the Afrika Korps, and in breaking it, broke the myth of German invincibility forever. The desert has reclaimed much of the battlefield now. Where once tanks burned and men died, tourists take photographs and development encroaches. But beneath the sand, the mines still wait, patient reminders of violence past. In the cemeteries, neat rows of headstones record names and ages, regiments and dates, the individual tragedies that made up the greater triumph. They fought with what they were given, these men of the 8th Army and the Afrika Korps. That what the 8th Army was given included 252 Sherman tanks, while the Afrika Korps made do with obsolete equipment, was not their choice, but their fate. History, they say, is written by the victors. But at El Alamein, history was written by Detroit assembly lines and British determination, by American steel and Commonwealth courage, by the simple fact that modern war had become a contest of production rather than prowess. The Sherman tank stands as symbol of this transformation, adequate rather than excellent, reliable rather than sophisticated, decisive through numbers rather than individual superiority. When it met the Panzer in the Devil's Gardens of El Alamein, an era ended and a new age began. In that new age, industrial might would matter more than military tradition, and victory would belong to those who could produce the most and supply it the furthest. Rommel learned this lesson in the hardest school of all, defeat. Montgomery applied it with methodical certainty, and the world changed forever.